Welcome, everybody. Happy New Year. Thank you for joining us for our first program sponsored by the Library Company and the program in African American history. I am Deirdre Cooper Owens, the director of the program in African American history, and I'm so delighted that you all joined us. I also need to get the formal thanks out of the way before I start my introduction of a very dear colleague of mine, Eric Herschel, who will be presenting tonight. So first, I'd like to extend thanks on behalf of the Library Company of Philadelphia, the country's oldest cultural institution, founded in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin. At the helm of the company is Michael Bersanti. Unfortunately, he's not able to join us, but he sends his greetings to you all and his thanks for not just joining us, but also supporting the Library Company of Philadelphia's programming. On a personal level, I would like to thank our tech person, at least for this program. She's much more than that, but Blanche Brown, who is behind the scenes assisting us. And also I give you greetings on behalf of the assistant director of this program and the archivist for African American history, Jasmine Smith. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Eric Herschel. Eric is an assistant professor of history at the University of Utah. He is the author of The Science of Abolition, How Slaveholders Became the Enemies of Progress. It was published by Yale University Press in 2021. And I am so happy to have this conversation with Eric, because I have to kind of give a shameless plug. I was one of the people who blurbed this really wonderful book, and I encourage all of you to go out and purchase it. We've placed some of those links in the chat. Eric not only is the author of this really brilliantly conceived and beautifully written text, but he has also appeared as a writer for various publications: the New York Times, the New Republic, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Review of Books. I met Eric in, I think, oh my goodness, I'm having a middle-aged moment. It probably was 2017, maybe. And he had just graduated from Columbia University, where he received his PhD in history, has an MA from Princeton, a BA from Princeton, if I'm not mistaken. And so as a trained historian, he's also a trained journalist. And I remember as we were talking, he was sharing with me the ways that he was really integrating his training as a historian and a journalist. So I invite you to Google some of his pieces. You'll see that beautiful writing extends even for lay audiences. He has won a number of fellowships. I can tell you that in our field, we're used to a lot of no's, but Eric somehow has the magic touch. So he gets a lot of yeses when it comes to fellowships. And so I'm just going to list a few, and you can see how prestigious they are. So he's had a month-long fellowship at the American Philosophical Society, also founded by Benjamin Franklin, the Huntington Fellowship in Pasadena, California. It is one of the country's highly respected and highly ranked libraries and cultural institutions for the history of science. The McNeil Center, another Philadelphia-based institution, the Ohio State University, and the Schomburg, the Schomburg Center for Black History and Research, which is in Harlem, New York. And so he has really proved himself in terms of being, I think, an emergent scholar in the history of science. And so without further ado, I am going to pass the mic to Professor Herschel. Thank you so much for joining us.
So thank you, Dr. Cooper Owens, for that beautiful introduction. I should get you more often to hype me. That was probably the best one that I've had ever for one of these book talks. I really appreciate it. Also, for you and everybody at the Library Company, Blanche Brown, who's been doing tech support, I really appreciate it. And making just this happen. It's really wonderful when people can engage with your work. And last is everybody who's out there. It's wonderful to get people, paying, optionally engaging in this kind of COVID era where everyone's obviously zoomed out, myself included. So thank you all. I hope everyone's healthy. And I'm just going to jump right into our talk, or maybe I should just preview the format. I'm going to talk about and kind of summarize the core arguments of the books. Of my book. It should take around 25 minutes, and then Professor Cooper Owens will engage in a short Q&A, and then they'll open it up to audience questions. So let me share my screen. I have some pretty slides that'll maybe give a little bit more texture to the talk. Everyone can see them. I'm assuming everyone can see them. Okay. And now I'll begin the formal talk. Throughout the winter, I'm sorry, wrong beginning. Okay. Throughout the summer of 1851, thousands of spectators withstood the sweltering heat of London's Hyde Park, waiting to enter the Crystal Palace, the structure on the slide, which was an enormous glass structure that had been built for that year's Great Exhibition. A predecessor to the World's Fair, the Great Exhibition functioned as a showcase for the day's most promising scientific invention, ones that the exhibition's promoters thought would offer hope for humanity's future. Britain had abolished slavery 13 years earlier, and now positioned itself as the global leader in the international fight against slavery. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the most talked about invention was a new chemical bath for flax fiber, whose inventors marketed as a technological solution to slavery. If independent farmers, black and white in the American Midwest, as well as in Ireland, cultivated flax, the inventors claimed, this chemical bath machine would turn flax into a cheaper alternative to slave-grown American cotton, effectively putting slaveholders out of business. Quote, the abolition of slavery will be greatly accelerated by the success of this machine, wrote one of the machine's inventors, a chemistry professor at London's Royal Polytechnic Institute. The chemical flax machine won a top prize at that year's Great Exhibition, and anti-slavery supporters in the United States, both radical abolitionists and more cautious white anti-slavery moderates, wasted no time in heralding cotton's doom. Quote, science is king, not cotton, wrote the New England Farmer, an anti-slavery agricultural journal. In another quotation, Henry Bibb, a fugitive former enslaved Black man who had established a free Black community in British Canada, wrote in his newspaper, quote, fugitive slaves should be standing in the front ranks of this experiment, explicitly referencing this new flax machine. The chemical machine was, in fact, one of a much broader array of scientific and technological inventions that British and American scientists, as well as Black and white abolitionists, used to discredit the institution of slavery. From the birth of the organized abolitionist movement in the 1770s and through British emancipation, as well as the American Civil War, anti-slavery men of science and Black and white abolitionists routinely portrayed slaveholders as scientifically inept and technologically unsophisticated. In short, the enemies of science. And yet, this image of slaveholders as the enemies of science tends not to be the first association many people have in regard to the relationship between science and slavery. If anything, historians generally assume that insofar as scientific knowledge mattered in the debates over slavery, it was slaveholders and not abolitionists who dominated the scientific discourse. In this popular telling, repeated by many academic historians, discussions of racial science take center stage, with many believing that slaveholders effectively won the scientific debate, given how common racist racial science was to slavery's defenders. Yet one of the core arguments of my book is that if we look beyond racial science and instead survey scientific arguments in their broadest sense, From ideas rooted in natural history, botany, and medicine, to technological inventions, as well as geology and even astronomy, an entirely different picture emerges. Rather than playing mere defense, abolitionists were often on the scientific offensive, and they were particularly successful at wedding the image of science to the cause of abolition. Appreciating abolitionist scientific arguments, or what I call the science of abolition, matters not only because it challenges the common assumption that enslavers vis-a-vis racial science dominated the scientific discourse around slavery. It matters because scientific arguments played a pivotal role in legitimizing the anti-slavery movement, which was particularly important in an era, the late Enlightenment, in which science was gaining cultural prestige and when abolitionists were trying to move beyond the movement's parochial and narrowly moral arguments. And secondly, understanding or appreciating the scientific arguments of abolitionists matters because the scientific case against slavery helps explain where the myth of slavery's backwardness comes from. The idea that is that slaveholders were hidebound aristocrats and that their institution, slavery, was bound to be defeated by the forces of modernity. In this last regard, my book speaks directly to the new history of slavery and capitalism. Much like the older scholarship on which it's based, these new histories are trying to challenge, and I think rightly, the notion that slavery had little to do with the rise of modern capitalism and closely associated symbols of modernity, like science, medicine, and technology. But what rarely goes asked in this new literature, both in its new form as well as its older ones, and what my book tries to answer, is where the idea that slavery was backwards comes from in the first place. One of my core arguments then is that Black and white abolitionists, along with their scientific allies, were essential to that myth's creation. By marshaling a wide range of scientific arguments, from ideas rooted again in chemistry, medicine, and botany, to technology and geology, they effectively portrayed slaveholders as the enemies of progress, and thus as fundamentally backwards. Now, for the remainder of this talk, I'll offer a brief overview of the kinds of scientific arguments that abolitionists in both Britain and the United States made against slavery. In the process, I'll highlight one of the core tensions that emerged between radical abolitionists, Black and white, especially in the antebellum United States. That emerged between radical abolitionists, Black and white, and their more moderate white anti-slavery allies, many of whom were men of science themselves. As we'll see, the mere fact that both radical and moderate opponents of slavery drew upon scientific ideas and scientific discourse did not mean that they deployed these ideas in the same way, or even for the precise same ends. And yet, despite these internal divisions between radicals and moderates, what I hope becomes clear is that science was, and perhaps has always been, an essential tool in the struggle for Black freedom. The notion that scientific ideas could be useful in the struggle against slavery dates at least to the Industrial Revolution, particularly in the latter 18th century England. Several members of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which was England's leading abolitionist society and founded in 1787, were prominent men of science. That included Josiah Wedgwood, best known as the potter of the Am I Not a Man and a Brother medallion, but who was also less appreciated, an accomplished chemist and member of the Royal Society, which was England's most prestigious scientific body. Though not a member, a close ally of Josiah Wedgwood was, and a vocal anti-slavery critic in the 1780s and 90s was Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, as well as Erasmus Darwin, an inventor, botanist, and the grandfather of Charles Darwin. These men were among the first to depict science as a great social equalizer in general, a force that could help eradicate, they believe, all social inequalities. And many of them highlighted slavery as one of the chief inequalities that science itself can help eradicate. Quote, the introductions of machines and free labor would help gradually eradicate slavery, Josiah Wedgwood wrote in 1788. A few years later, his close friend, Erasmus Darwin, speculated in a scientific paper that, quote, if sugar could be made from its elements without the assistance of vegetation, which is to say, if sugar could be made through chemical processes, essentially in a laboratory, rather than through agricultural, slave-based agriculture, there might not be any need for slavery at all. And fast forwarding to 1825, London's anti-slavery monthly reporter echoed these arguments, writing that, quote, in no one instance had slavery and the use of mechanical inventions existed together. These technological and chemical arguments were joined by a host of arguments rooted in natural history. From the founding of Sierra Leone in 1787 through the 1820s, the colony's anti-slavery founders relied extensively on explorers, naturalists, and physicians, as well as Black settlers, to find scientific evidence that might prove to imperial officials that free Black colonies could be just as commercially successful as enslaved Caribbean colonies. To take just one example, William Allen, a wealthy white British chemist and an abolitionist, kept up a decade-long correspondence with several of Sierra Leone's Black settlers throughout the 1810s, republishing their scientific findings in his anti-slavery pamphlets. Writing privately to one of these Black settlers, a man named James Wise, in March of 1814, Allen asked whether, quote, if any person in the colony is capable of corresponding with me who has a taste for natural history. Throughout the 1810s, John Cazell, another Black settler who won his freedom fighting for the British during the American War of Independence, sent Allen several letters back in London detailing his own scientific expeditions into the African interior and providing him with updates on the colony's botanical experiments, in addition to sending him, and this is from a private letter, quote, 3 specimens of medicine that you will accept as from a friend. For American abolitionists, jumping over to the other side of the Atlantic, scientific ideas played an equally prominent role. 3 of the first 4 presidents of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, the new American nation's leading abolitionist society, were prominent men of science, including Benjamin Franklin, as well as Benjamin Rush. Several decades later, Benjamin Silliman, pictured in this slide, who was Yale's first official chemistry professor, a leading scientific thinker in the early Republic, and a member of the New Haven Anti-Slavery Society, wrote a report for the federal government which argued that the institution of slavery was preventing Louisiana sugar planters from investing in more profitable and labor-saving technologies. Quote, the account given nearly 40 years ago by Brian Edwards, the celebrated historian and slaveholder of the West Indies, Silliman wrote, is substantially a statement of what happens to this hour. Basically, Silliman was saying that the slavery, or he was implying at least, that slavery was preventing sugar planters from adopting new technologies that would eradicate the need for slavery on Louisiana sugar plantations. The relationship between anti-slavery men of science, most of them who were elite, white male elites, and abolitionist societies had changed dramatically in the antebellum period, defined here as roughly between 1830 and the onset of the Civil War. Before the 1830s, men of science were prominent figures in both the American and British abolitionist societies. But in the 1830s, as anti-slavery momentum had initially stalled, and as early anti-slavery momentum had stalled, and a series of slave rebellions shook the Atlantic world, abolitionist societies, particularly in the United States, became more radical, demanding more drastic change. Increasingly led by free Black Americans, these, quote, second wave abolitionist societies of the antebellum period rejected the earlier movement's gradualism and its skittishness about the question of Black citizenship. Instead, these new, more radical abolitionist societies demanded the immediate uncompensated end to slavery, as well as full Black citizenship. But as abolitionism became more radical, it also became less respectable, and men of science increasingly kept their distance from actually joining them. But, and this is important, many Northern men of science, most of them white, remained adamantly opposed to slavery, even if they didn't join these radical societies. And along with the more radical abolitionists, they continued, these men of science, to press in public discourse the scientific case against slavery. One of the more common scientific arguments made by both moderate anti-slavery men of science, as we'll see in a moment, as well as radical abolitionists who use scientific language but may not have been sort of publicly recognized men of science themselves, related to new technologies. Echoing Wedgwood and Silliman decades earlier, both moderates and radicals argued that new technological inventions, like the chemical machine that debuted in that 1851 Great Exhibition, would sooner or later make slave labor obsolete. The Scientific American, which was a popular scientific magazine based in New York, gave the actual chemical machine that I had mentioned its full vote of approval, calling it, quote, a very philosophic idea. Meanwhile, Horace Greeley, the white anti-slavery editor of the United States' largest newspaper, the New York Times of its day, which was the New York Tribune, wrote several columns praising this machine, as well as highlighting its anti-slavery potential. In one of my favorite quotes that I found in my research, he wrote, in relation to this flax machine, "Perhaps South Carolina would secede from chemistry, as well as from the Union of Common Sense." But here's where things begin to get a bit more interesting. Unlike radical abolitionists, white anti-slavery moderates, by far more numerous than radical Black and white abolitionists, often positioned scientific solutions to slavery as a kind of anti-politics. That is, they saw scientific arguments as a way to avoid sectional conflict by arguing that technological solutions would eventually make slavery unnecessary. In other words, moderates argued that it was better to wait for a technological fix to slavery rather than engage in a divisive and possibly violent political struggle over slavery. As one moderate Boston newspaper wrote in 1861, quote, "The genius who would discover a flax substitute for cotton would do more for the abolition of slavery than 1,000 abolitionist senators combined." So how did radical abolitionists, and I want to focus on Black abolitionists in particular, respond to this co-option of scientific ideas by anti-slavery moderates? Perhaps surprisingly, many Black abolitionists, despite their own internal differences, chose to embrace many of the same arguments made by these moderates. It was an age of science, Frederick Douglass wrote in 1854, and Black abolitionists could either turn away from science and risk being seen as against modernity, exactly the opposite image that anti-slavery leaders had been generating since the movement's inception, or they could engage with these scientific arguments and perhaps try to shape them to their own ends. Frederick Douglass's newspaper, in fact, reported on the chemical machine weeks before Greeley's New York Tribune did. And he continued to report on later versions of the flax machine long after Greeley had stopped. Douglass also touted other scientific advances that he believed held anti-slavery potential, including a report by the revered German chemist, Justus von Liebig, who claimed that asparagus had more caffeine than coffee. And to Douglass, this suggested a possible free labor alternative to slave-grown coffee in the Caribbean and parts of Brazil. So why did Black abolitionists embrace scientific solutions, particularly in light of the ways it was being co-opted by anti-slavery moderates, again, who were trying to stall a bloody conflict over slavery by pointing to science as a kind of ultimate solution? Well, I argue that they did so for a number of reasons. First, embracing scientific ideas was a way to keep more moderate mainstream white Northerners within the broader anti-slavery camp, given the popular appeal of science at the time. Second, the chemical flax machine in particular could help the boycott movement against slave-grown cotton, which Black and white women abolitionists had revived in the 1820s, and had blossomed by the 1840s. Third, and perhaps most importantly, free Black communities in the North often promoted scientific ideas and scientific education within their own communities because they believed that learning scientific knowledge would make them useful citizens. To embrace science was, in other words, a way of making a claim on citizenship. Quote, where can we find among ourselves our men of science? Where are our lecturers in natural history, our critics in useful knowledge, said Mariah W. Stewart, a Black educator and abolitionist, to an all-Black Boston audience in 1833. To be sure, not all radical abolitionists embraced scientific arguments. Throughout the 1850s, William Lloyd Garrison, the radical white abolitionist leader, routinely denounced scientific arguments against slavery, be they ones pointing to steam engines or chemical flax machines as possible technological solutions to the problem of slavery. The core of Garrison's argument was that slaveholders kept their slaves not for the money, but for the power. Therefore, scientific solutions, which were often based on the logic that technological innovations would exert economic pressure on slaveholders, were destined to fail. Quote, it's not profit that makes slavery so devilish, but man's love of power, he wrote. No amount of financial pressure could convince a slaveholder, in Garrison's eyes, to embrace abolition. In his view, they needed a moral reckoning. Garrison may have had a point, but I would also that he also had the luxury of moral purity, something that many Black abolitionists in particular had lacked. Many Black leaders had family and friends who were still enslaved, and unlike Garrison, they felt the daily ostracism that came with being Black in America, a humiliation many believed would not lessen so long as slavery remained intact. And never in the nation's history had so many white Northerners expressed a basic disdain for slavery. By embracing scientific arguments then, even when they were often twisted to support a more tepid anti-slavery political agenda, radical Black abolitionists were not compromising on their principles. Rather, they were shaping their message in a way that white moderates could understand. After all, it was mainstream moderate anti-slavery political parties, like the bulk of the Republican Party, that radical abolitionists would use to push through a more radical agenda. For Black abolitionists, embracing scientific ideas functioned in much the same way. Scientific ideas were vehicles to push through a more radical political agenda. Black abolitionists may or may not have believed that scientific ideas held the key to emancipation, but they understood that many white Northerners did or wanted to, and Black abolitionists understood that they needed their support. If that meant promoting scientific solutions to slavery to achieve their goals, so be it. It was true that scientific ideas were used by both white anti-slavery moderates and slavery's defenders to ends that were often antithetical to true Black freedom. But Black abolitionists and their white allies never rejected the importance of science to their movement. Science, they understood, was power. And with the power that scientific ideas gave them, radical abolitionists would set about making the enslaved free. I can say that that is the end of my formal prepared remarks. Nope. Deidre, I think we need your volume.
So sorry. Thank you so much. Let's see here. If you have questions, please remember to put them in the Q&A feature. I see it's beginning to fill up, but as Professor Herschel has mentioned before, I get first dibs. And so first I want to thank you for such an illuminating talk. And so I have questions and then I have a comment that I think I'll end with. But as you were talking, I was reminded of so much regarding the conceptions of slaveholders and the institution of slavery and how the South and these folk were seen as kind of anti-science. And as someone who was also a historian of slavery, I'm like, it couldn't be further from the truth, right? And so it made me think of the Mississippi Secession statement. And although you don't write about it, I just wanted to read this, and I think it goes well with the ways that modern conceptions of slaveholders have been that they have been anti-scientific. And I think what your book is showing that it hasn't. So let me just read this, hold on, this excerpt. So the Mississippi Secession Statement, Mississippi was the second state to secede from the Union, and it says, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. Now here is the scientific piece. These products are peculiar to the climate, verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the Black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. And so often when I talk to students, and I'm sure you've had these conversations too, there's this sense that these men, because they were so anti-Black and racist, that they were just ignorant. And I was like, no, even their political statements were rife with these inferences to science. Right. And so it's interesting to me that you're bringing this to the forefront. What was the motivation behind doing this particular practice with your book?
Or challenging, challenging. Well, there's two. Let me just sort of focus on the academic scholarship, because this is at the end of the day an academic book. I hope it's written in a way and sort of gestures towards broader that a general public can enjoy it as well, or learn from it. But I think, when you're reading, as Professor Cooper, as you know very well, the history of science today, as it's written in academic spaces, there's the overriding logic, and I understand, I agree with, it's in my work, is to be critical of science, right? This isn't, infallible knowledge. And one way in which we do that is we show the ways in which science was complicit in empire, colonialism, and slavery. That is to say, if you're reading much of the good scientific academic writing for the past 20, 30 years, all of it is showing the ways in which, we don't call it pseudoscience, the scientific racism of the day. No, we highlight the point, that was legitimate science as a way to get us past the thinking that science is somehow outside of human culture. So my reading of the literature is that it's the scientific literature that engages with slavery, is that overwhelmingly the stories we tell are stories like your book, the ways in which some of the most established medical scientific practitioners were leaders, widely respected both in the United States and abroad, and they were respected and they understood science. They were not backwards anti-science. They were standing at the fore of scientific knowledge. This, on the one hand, I don't at all challenge your or anybody else's work in highlighting that point, but there's a dearth of studies of the ways in which abolitionists were also using scientific ideas to directly challenge that very real reality of pro-slavery figures using scientific knowledge to defend slavery. And here's the critical thing, and this is why I want to highlight, one of the core interventions. And you saw in my talk, I highlight only the technological piece, but there is, racial science, for obvious reasons, it's still with us today, or at least race, or kind of has, in the public scientific sort of connotations, is so much of the literature that engages with science and slavery is focusing on racial science.
Yes.
So I want to say, look, if you're looking at only that stuff, like that quote that you just read, right, that's saying that Black people are biologically meant for hotter climates, you are going to find a lot. It is going to seem as if slavery figures dominated the scientific discourse. But what happens if we step back and look at science broadly conceived, technology, natural history, chemistry? There, I'm finding a whole lot of arguments, a consistent theme that all, whatever the specialty is, chemistry, natural history, whatever, it's all coming back to a very kind of frontal argument by abolitionists that are saying, no, slavery is backwards. You can't even have a technological sophistication in slavery because it makes them it doesn't sort of propel the sort of inventive aspect. So in this way, I want to highlight that actually abolitionists had a rich arsenal of scientific sort of arguments in their back pocket, and that we should be thinking about that in our general understandings of kind of who won the scientific debate. It wasn't only the pro-slavery scientific racists.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that. There's something else. This is more the comment. And then I think what I'm going to do, because I see we do have some questions that are coming in. So I'm going to just make a comment that I would like for you to respond to, and then get to the questions and kind of integrate the one or two questions that I have left. But this is this is the comment that I was really taken by with reading your book, but also in your talk. You do a really wonderful job, I think, especially as a first-time author, of presenting an intellectually mature and holistically pure way of thinking about the balance that needed to happen with presenting both sides. And so in particular, I'm thinking about the ways that naturalists emerge, right? That if we expand, as you just so eloquently stated, if we expand beyond this notion of just racial science kind of dominating, but to think about naturalists, especially those who were interested in, say, economic botany, how they sought the new natural commodities to increase the profitability of like the colonial project. I think other naturalists were really engaged in explaining the causes of like physical differences between groups of people. And so as you know, the late 18th century, this is when these kind of hardening of racial categories were happening. It was framed in the language of the natural sciences and supported through these references to scientific texts, right? But the scientific texts and the scientists themselves were also involved in late 18th and early 19th century debates over abolition, slave trade and slavery. So what I think your book shows is apologists on both sides, kind of marshaled evidence from natural histories, from travel accounts, medical treatments, other scientific texts, right, that supported their arguments. And so that's why I say, I think this is a really intellectually mature book that a lot of first books aren't able to do. And so how were you able to balance that? I mean, just as a kind of grad student attending, what's the technique behind finding that balance?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot sort of in that question. You know, I will say one of the challenges, I mean, maybe I'll just take a step back. I mean, I came to graduate school not at all knowing that I would do a project like this. I came to work on slavery, in particular in the age of revolution. That's why many people who will read my book notice that the dominant period is the age of revolution, 1770, 1830, and then the antebellum was what I added as I realized, hey, I gotta get to the end of the story, the end of slavery. And I think I didn't I engaged with the history of science, being exposed to it for the first time in graduate school, and I realized that if the instinct, if you're thinking only as a slavery scholar, which is what I consider myself foremost, is again to go to the racial science. And as soon as I started to look how historians of science were doing the history of science for the past even 40 years, a kind of social construction, sort of approach to the history of science, I was noticing that there was so much more space to engage with kind of other political aspects of science that were, again, beyond racial science. And I just didn't know how to do that because my ignorant impression was that the only thing that history of science care about, if they're interested in chemistry or botany, is because I was ignorant, was, oh, well, how did they, a kind of internalist approach. Well, how did they discover a molecule and what were the internal debates? I didn't realize that there was all these political and social forces, sort of impeding on science and vice versa, that, kind of scientific knowledge was, you can study the history of science from a perspective in a way that my book very much does, about how science is used sort of in public debates. And once I realized that that was something that you can legitimately do as a scholar, all of a sudden I realized, hold on, all these fields are open to me insofar as they existed in historical time. The emergence of chemistry is happening as we know it in the 1780s and 1790s. So all of a sudden, this whole realm, I can go beyond racial science to really, discover new things and make what I hope is an interesting argument and expose this kind of discourse that is often, which is simply not discussed because of the narrow focus on racial.
Right. Thank you for that. So I'm going to go to the Q&A, and I'm really happy that the questions have been coming in. So I'm going to go to, and I hope I am pronouncing your first name correctly. I apologize if I don't. Shamile Jordan. Where did William Still fall within, I guess, where did he fall with regards to science?
William Still, the Black abolitionist?
Yeah.
That's I don't know. I can't tell you that the short answer is I don't know. I didn't look closely at what he had said about science. But I will say, insofar, so one thing to keep in mind, when I look at Black abolitionists who are now writing their own newspapers, right? I mean, I have a whole thing on Benjamin Banneker, which I was really excited about, but most people know that if you're studying, literate Black society, you're studying Black newspapers, and really the world opens up to you in the late 1820s, when the first Black newspapers run by Black people are available. So in my final chapter, especially, that's where much of this talk was coming from. You get a lot of what are Black people saying about science. Yeah. And the really interesting thing to say, as you saw with Frederick Douglass, who I highlight, is that they were, again, engaged in a much broader conversation beyond issues of race. But unquestionably, because the racial question, the rise, as Professor Cooper Owens was saying, of a hardened racial science, where there was a sort of biological essentialism emerging in the early 19th century. Black abolitionists had a lot of things to say about it. I talk about it a bit in my book, but what I want to say is that if you really want to read one of the better recent books about it, I would argue Mia Bay's book was really influential in my mind, which talks about the white image in the Black mind, and it covers how Black people engaged with racist racial science in this period. And the one thing that I want to highlight, and I think this is interesting because it complicates a simple portrayal of Black people as A, monolithic, or B, simply all of them were anti-racist science. Right. But what I love what Mia Bay does, and what I basically echo in my book when talking about Black abolitionists engaging with racial science, is that many of them, in trying to construct a pro-Black racial science, reinstantiate a kind of racial essentialism. And the person that you see this come through most clearly with is Martin Delaney, one of the few formally educated Black, educated at Harvard Medical School in the 1850s, so highly educated, one of the very few. And when you read his scientific work, and again, I'm saying nothing original here, this is very much Mia Bay, she points out, look, he was essentializing Black people. He said that basically Black people who came to America, because they had integrated in a better climate and had intermixed with white people through violence of slavery, they were more civilized than ethnic Africans who were dark and corrupted. My point isn't to simply say, look, both people are racist. My point is to see that this is what happens when we try to explain the social contract of race through a scientific lens. Even in trying to make an anti-racist racial science, you fall into the trap of thinking of race as in the scientific terms of the era. And that can be ethnology of the 1850s or genomic science for today. As soon as your understanding of how to explain race is rooted in a fundamental, scientific language, whatever era, you're bound to repeat some of these essential components, which ignores the social construction of race. And Black people were not immune to it, even though they were trying to do it for anti-slavery.
Let me tell you, you heard the Southerner come out in me. I couldn't even be quiet. Yes, because this is the thing. Eric and I keep saying we need to talk. We need to have a conference. That's such a great question and response, because that conversation, that debate is coming up again, even in the ways that we discuss epigenetics, right? And the science of carrying oppression in your DNA, in your blood, right? And so those are things that are still with us. So
it makes me very nervous, the epigenetic business, right? It makes me very, very nervous, the way that it's being used.
We need to have a conference. All right, so this is interesting because you mentioned the Genome Project. So Pamela McDonald has a question. Do you have any insights into how the findings of the Human Genome Project have affected racism around the world? Thank you for that question.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to give the stock answer. And again, every year it's changing because scientists are people, and therefore race is a thing that's very much alive with us. So scientists are curious, and the standard issue up until the turn of the 20th century, the Human Genome Project was, as I'm forgetting who it was, Watson and Crick, whoever, whatever it was, right, famously said this proves that human beings are 99.9% more alike than they are different, because most of the genome. So I would say that that's the stock answer. That is to say that if we've learned anything from the Genomic Project, it's how similar the human genome is across race. But of course, I will be loath to ignore what many historians of science who study the racial science angle will tell you today, is the 21st century has seen a reemergence of scientists re-engaging with this question of, and Rich, every few years there's a new scientist, often very prestigious one. The most latest is something Reich. He teaches at Harvard, a very wonderful, paleogenetics or whatever it's called. And he, published a book a few years ago that was saying, actually, if we don't say race, but we say, geological space of origin, racial categories basically roughly map on to geological origins. And then, of course, people from the humanities who study this, sociologists, historians, etc., pushed back immediately and said, no, you're misunderstanding, how race operates, and so again, the debate about can science explain race is alive and well. And while we thought that at the turn of the 21st century, the human genome announcement, more similar than different, would have ended the debate for well and good, what we have learned in the past 20 of years is so long as race is around, scientists will use their toolkit to try to explain it. And often it hasn't gone very well, including at this moment.
Yes, thank you for that. Olga Sapina, once again, I apologize if I mispronounced your last name, asks, would it be fair to say that scientifically minded abolitionists were, in some sense, progenitors of the modern techno-utopians who tend to seem scientific and technological solutions to societal problems? Thank you.
I love that question. And it's frankly, my book is not a simple celebration. It's obvious that my sympathies are with abolitionists in general, and I'm deeply sympathetic to the Black abolitionists. They really are my heroes when I teach and what have you. Again, as well as some of the white abolitionists. John Brown is a hero. But they're flawed and there's problems with their visions. And I think one of the things that gets lost sometimes when we're talking about the power of Black activism in my era, Black abolitionism or interracial abolitionism, is we miss, when we only focus on the heroism or use them as kind of a useful history, and I don't like that term because I think any history is useful, and thinking of, anyways, let me just stick on track here, is, what was I just saying? I totally lost my train of thought. Techno-utopians, yes. One of the things that, as I highlight at the end of my talk, as this questioner pointed out, is, there's a very liberal notion baked in to this science. Science is the savior. White moderates would use it as a total techno, many white moderates, particularly men of science, whites especially didn't want a civil war, even if they were opposed to slavery. So they would say, whoa, guys, chill out. Let's kind of invest more in technology, right? Eventually, planters will realize that a machine is cheaper and more efficient than a Black body. That was the argument, particularly in the 1850s, by many white moderate scientific people with authority. But Black abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, had a very, what we would call, neoliberal, techno-utopian vision of science. And that, as much as I would like to ignore that and portray Frederick Douglass as a radical, kind of speaking in the kind of left, socialisty, racial justice politics of the moment today, I don't think he fully was. I think he was radical when it came to the issue of race and demanding, but he was many ways, and again, which is to say, he was a product of his time. He was a liberal. He really believed that technology would help solve many human problems. He loved technology. I mean, one of the things that historians often talk about, they don't talk about it as technology, but is the photography, right? I mean, we know now that he was photographing himself a lot, and that was a modern technology, and he loved it precisely because it can counter the caricatures of Black people in the media. He was the most photographed man in America, we now know, more than Abraham Lincoln, and that was
right.
And he was using that technology to show as an anti-slavery tool to say, hey, look, no, this is what Black people look like. And look at Frederick Douglass. He's a beautiful man, right? I don't blame him. I would take a picture every day if I was Frederick Douglass.
Right, exactly.
But the point is, yes, they really did have a near utopian, a very liberal view. They weren't always sensitive to the ways in which, or let me put a caveat here. When Black abolitionists, as well as some white abolitionists, are critiquing racial science, and this is what Frederick Douglass famously says, he gives one lecture solely on racial science. He says, scientists often say what is popular, I'm paraphrasing, rather than what is true. By that, he was aware of what we would today, the ways in which scientists are no different. They're social human beings. So when he was pointing out the flaws of racial science, he was saying, look, I still believe that science is a powerful tool, but these people, the scientists who are telling us that Black people are somehow inferior are no different, are no less immune from the social forces of the day than anybody else. So they, or at least people like Frederick Douglass, did have a certain awareness that scientific knowledge was not infallible.
Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful example. As you said that, it made me think about conversations about the kind of shifting ideas of what's scientific. And I'll just say this because more questions have come up. But on social media, I tend to post a lot of pictures of my mother's garden. She's a retired science teacher with a degree in biology back in the 60s, professional biology. And she's really into gardening. But there are these questions about, is it gardening or agriculture? Because she's applying these kind of scientific methods to growing. I mean, the woman has banana trees and pomegranate bushes in the low country of South Carolina, right? But what's interesting is the ways that certain Black friends of mine see this. And they're like, this is also a conduit for Black liberation in the 21st century. How do we live off the land? Can your mother teach workshops? And I'm talking about people who are involved in, really progressive and radical Black organizations who are really interested in something that they see as very scientific, but also very ancestral. And so it's, once again, it's just something that you bring up that's really quite interesting and still has retentions in the 21st century. Marcy Denius, looking more broadly than the Anglo-African at racial science, especially in the late 18th century context, and here she has some parentheses, she's thinking Humboldt, Diderot, and others, also helped to get us past the scholarly problem of representing racial science as exclusively pro-slavery. I'm sorry, she says Anglo-American, not Anglo-African. Sorry. Thank you, Marcy, I just corrected. Thank you.
So I think this gets back to what I was just saying about how Black people did engage with racial science. And again, that comes up very clearly a little bit when I talk about Banneker, but also in the antebellum period, where Black people are engaging and challenging the nakedly racist racial science, but also in so doing, in trying to construct a pro-Black racial sometimes characterizing race as some kind of essentialist and even anti-Black in their praise of the kind of mixed race African American, more civilized because he has implicitly white blood in him rather than the kind of heathen African. I mean, that's something that the most authoritative Black thinkers are saying. People like Martin Delaney and Frederick Douglass, his close friend, are sort of reiterating these sort of comments. But let me just say that this isn't. I've been focusing a bit on the Black, kind of reinscribing of a kind of racist racial science, even if they didn't intend to. But let me highlight also the white people that were doing it. And in fact, this project, the germ of this project, in terms of where the rubber hit the road, asking, well, what did abolitionists say about science, actually did become with something like racial science. And I focused, Professor Cooper Owens will know this, on Benjamin Rush. And I wrote a paper about it. He's one of the figures in my book. And he was also he was a white man. He wasn't a Quaker, but he was one of the few non-Quakers to join the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, the most prominent, influential, and organized anti-slavery society in the kind of revolutionary era, deeply committed to anti-slavery. But he infamously writes a lecture and promotes the idea that actually the races are no different. He's trying to create an anti-racist racial science. And how is he doing that? He's saying, look, beneath our skin colors, our phenotypes, we are all fundamentally the same. Beautiful, good, I would agree. Then he goes on and he tries to explain the reason why Black people in particular have deviated from the white norm. He takes whiteness to be the norm implicitly. And he writes a very not influential, but a prominent lecture. Many people don't gravitate to the idea, but the underlying concept, as I'll explain in a minute, they do. He says, Black people have their Black skin because in the Bible, which was taken as a credible scientific source for historical information, they were exposed to leprosy in ancient Egypt, and the lingering effects of that leprosy is manifest. It's not dangerous in their darker skin, their curly hair, their physical features. And therefore, he says, don't worry, white people, it's not dangerous. You're not going to catch leprosy if you associate with Black people. But the key to actually finally and forever curing Black people of their Blackness is to set them free. Because anytime a human body is put in harmful physical or natural environments, like the oppression of slavery and all the kind of environmental harm you do to the body, you will only cause their underlying conditions to continue to perpetuate. So free Black people, put them in a healthy environment, and they will gradually over time turn white.
Yes.
This is anti-racist, or actually anti-slavery racial science by a white man, and it is clearly what we today would say racist. Yeah. So again, the problem though isn't much different from the problem of Martin Delaney. They're trying to explain race in a strictly scientific sense, and that always, or almost always that I've ever seen, leads to some very weird, strange, and frankly racist ways of thinking about race that aren't actually helpful. Yeah. Nonetheless, it happened.
Yeah, yeah, the essentialism, that it's the connective tissue. So D. Andrews asks, thank you too for that. D. Andrews asks, did the moderates take the next step in their scientific arguments to say what would happen to former slaves once the technological revolution had occurred? Is that why the colonization arguments remained widespread?
Oh, there's a lot in there. And thank you, Professor Owens. Professor D. Andrews. I'm a big fan of your work. It's really happy to see you here. I have to say that I didn't look much beyond, if I understand your question correctly, I'm not entirely sure I do, and that's my fault. But if the question is, did white anti-slavery moderates think about the longer term consequences of technological solutions and still had a problem, I think, with Black people being free and living in America, and therefore that's why they supported colonization. If that's the logic that I think you might be suggesting, then I didn't make the connection. But certainly, at the very least, I can say that many of these white moderates are most certainly in favor of colonization, which was, again, the mainstream anti-slavery Republican Party. It wasn't part of their agenda per se, but Lincoln, certainly the figures who I speak of in my book, whether it's Benjamin Silliman Benjamin Silliman, who starts out as a Yale grad in the early 1800s, is part of this kind of early abolitionist movement where they don't really talk about citizenship. But by the 1830s, like many Ivy League Northern scientific elites who had grown up, imbibing the Enlightenment, liberal, anti-slavery point of view, are aghast by these new radical abolitionists, and they embrace colonization. So Benjamin Silliman, again, one of the most prominent early American scientists in the early Republican antebellum period, he's selected as the president in 1857 of the National Compensation Emancipation something. It's meant to be a rival to the American Anti-Slavery Organization. And their idea is the radicals are too crazy, right? They want to just turn property into nothing, don't compensate the owners, get rid of slavery immediately, and allow Black citizenship to happen almost immediately. He's saying, no, let's hold on to the older agenda, the early abolitionist agenda, and let's actually moderately and let's try to negotiate with slaveholders, pay them off, and continue to encourage free Black people to emigrate leave to the Caribbean, Brazil, wherever, West Africa, etc. So insofar as he is Silliman is representative of a very important figure in my book, insofar as he's a representative of a moderate white anti-slavery figure, I think he captures this idea that on the one hand he's promoting technological solutions, on the other hand his political agenda is yes, technological solutions. And once we ultimately get rid of Black people, let's still not force them, but encourage them to, leave the country, because implicitly we want to keep this country white. Yeah. That was a long-winded answer, and I think it's because I may not fully grasp the question.
Yeah. Yeah, and we do a lot of engaging in the chat. So Professor Andrews, you can also let us know if he got at the kernel of what you're asking. So with that, as you were talking, I was thinking about obviously your work on Benjamin Banneker. You've written about him in the popular press, but also we served on a panel where you talked about his abolitionism. Hold on. Yep. Oh, Professor D. Andrews says you grasped it right. Fantastic session. So you hit the nail on the head.
I took a winding road to get there, but I think I got there.
That's a you're a quick nick on your feet. That's what that means. But I was thinking about, especially your work on Benjamin Banneker, right? At least for that 18th century era, he's arguably the most well-known Black scientist at the time, looking at astronomy, building the clock. I mean, all of those things, right? He was one of the names I learned when I was growing up as a child.
Of course.
During Black History Month in the late 70s and early 80s. But in your book, I don't want to give it all away. But in the beginning of your book, you mention how Banneker uses science and Africa to really as an abolitionist writing, but also to prove, how dependent Europeans and white folk were on Black,
African science.
That's right, African science. So he talks about, the Moors were the ones who were really developing astronomy, and he does those kinds of things. And so I think what's important, and I mentioned this in the blurb in the back of the book that I was so happy about, this is a social history of science. I mean, we've been doing social history of slavery for a long time. So that doesn't necessarily, to me, kind of merit the attention that the social history of science does, because we haven't been doing that work for that long. So this is really important, because what you're doing is centering the work of these Black abolitionist men, and they're primarily men for the most part, who are using African interventions in science making and in the kind of scientific knowledge production in ways that are linked to politics, and the politics being anti-slavery, and anti-slavery activism and abolitionism. But what it also made me think about were two people, Onesimus, Cotton Mather's slave. So for those, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but for those who might be unfamiliar, Cotton Mather's well-known preacher during the colonial period, also prolific author and well-known intellectual. And he was gifted an enslaved man born in Africa, Onesimus, who he was named Onesimus. But anyway, epidemics happen, smallpox is going on. Cotton Mather's notices that some of the African enslaved folk are not contracting smallpox, and he goes to Onesimus, who he writes is quite bright, and he wants to know why. Onesimus then tells him, hey, we've been inoculating in my country for a really long time, and essentially teaches him inoculation, right? And so he's freed by that medical / scientific knowledge. And even someone who was not learned, Harriet Tubman, we were on a panel and I talked about the ways that she had to understand astronomy, but also the ecological landscape in order to do abolitionist work, not being able to read and write. So I want you to just talk a little bit about how were you able to conceptualize these things and write about it in a way that links politics to scientific knowledge production?
So I think this is, and for those in the audience, I imagine many people who are engaged in the history of science know this already, but for those who aren't, I mean, as it's practiced in the academy mostly today, and actually, I don't know how I focus on, science and empire and science and slavery, that kind of subgenre of the history of science. And one of the things that you see in much of this literature, and I'm thinking, of Londa Schiebinger, Sasha Turner, James Del Borgo, one of my advisors, all, the Science of Empire, Neil Safier, all these people, right? One of the things that's been the big thrust of this scholarship is not only to show how elite science upholstered empire, right? The dark vision of science, but also how colonized, enslaved, non-Western people surreptitiously, or not should say surreptitiously, but either contributed to scientific knowledge but were erased in the official public record, or re-understanding, and this is really important, what we mean by science.
Right.
And what we mean, and this I think is what your question is getting at, and what I try to get at, because that history of science literature is deeply influential to my own work. And Professor Cooper Owens, you do it also in your own work when you're talking about the enslaved women who were helping Dr. Sims in the work, right? You want to show that Black women actually perform meaningful intellectual work in this process. So how do we get them into the historical record and understand the ways in which they did make genuine contributions, if they did? How do we do that? So one way in which I try to do it in my book, because of systemic racism, Black people are basically essentially barred from any kind of reading, writing, let alone education, let alone advanced education like a scientific degree. How do you get at their story, in a story that's rooted around the use of scientific knowledge? Well, how I try to do it, and I got a taste of it in my little talk where I talk about Sierra Leone. I have a chapter on Sierra Leone. And while William Allen is this elite white figure, abolitionist and man of science in the 1810s, he's head of the most important British anti-slavery society at that moment, the African institution. He's relying on to show that Sierra Leone has a wonderful ecological landscape. I mean, if you look at his private letters, not the public stuff, but the private letters, he is relying on the colony's Black settlers, who are themselves relying on the indigenous West Africans to tell us what plants have medicinal properties, what type of crops grow best in this environment. And many historians of science would say is that is science. Knowledge of the natural world is science. If we expand what we mean by science to include, some sort of empirical engagement with the natural world, many cultures do that. And African people, indigenous people, poor white people do that. And therefore, I try to get those voices by reading not only the public science of people like William Allen, who is publishing things that often make no mention of the Black people who are helping him, but looking at his private letters and seeing that actually, how is he getting his knowledge? How is he producing the knowledge? Well, he's relying on people, local Black people on the ground, to tell him what works and what doesn't from an agricultural point of view and even from a medicinal point of view.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's wonderful. In fact, I wanted to read this comment in the chat before we kind of say our goodbyes. I don't want to say goodbye because this is such an interesting conversation. But Pamela McDonald, who asked the earlier question, says, thank you for speaking about Onesimus. I'm currently writing a paper about him to present for Asala later this month, but this conversation will be helpful to link him to Benjamin Banneker. So, this is the kind of knowledge reduction that we want. Go ahead.
I just want to jump in there about Banneker. I encourage Professor Dr. Miss McDonald, if you're presenting something, I encourage you. I recently have an article in Slavery and Abolition where I actually explore a bit, and I'm relying a lot on other scholars who have kind of speculated, and we can't go very far with it. But the ways in which indigenous African astronomy or mathematical sort of knowledge we can't go much further than that by the evidence we have, but may have sort of influenced Banneker's interest in astronomy and sort of mathematical thinking broadly defined. And again, similar to Onesimus, who is relying on African inoculation practices that are picked up by white Western elites, Banneker, even though he's, I find Banneker, I love what I kind of try to say about him, that he's co-opted actually by white abolitionist allies who want to use him as a prop for being kind of, look, this is an example that Black people aren't innately intellectually inferior. He can do science. And one of the things that I show is that, look, he was actually, deeply informed by possibly informed by non-Western modes of scientific knowledge. And it's the white people that impose this Western notion of science onto him. And that, yes, he was very much an intellectual, but in many ways, the kind of intellectual knowledge that Banneker had, not only the kind of possible influence of his African ancestors, but also his day-to-day living was as a tobacco farmer, his agricultural knowledge, his wood-making knowledge. Many Black people had that knowledge, right? So insofar as we make Banneker an exception or an exceptional, one of the first scientific thinkers, I'm trying to challenge that notion and to say, no, we only remember him that way because white people chose to, paint him as like a white scientific thinker. But if we put his skills, wood making, agriculture, and possible African influences, we see that many enslaved people had those exact skills, but they weren't around in the time and place for white people to need them as props and at that moment, the white-led anti-slavery movement. Yeah. So in that way, thinking more expansively of what scientific knowledge means helps us see Banneker as actually not being so unique in his kind of intellectual skill.
Yeah, this is, thank you so much. You got another kudos from, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, either Ivan Jurin or Ivan Jurin. But thank you. He says, thanks for a very interesting topic about science and slavery interactions. Kudos. This is exactly what we're trying to do here with our programming, you know, to not have these kinds of pie in the sky conversations, but to be able to bring sometimes highly theoretical works in a way that we all are able to access it and have conversations and see the ways that they intersect with our lives in the 21st century. You know, and to also think about these archival documents that, you know, sometimes gather dust, but to think about them in ways that are really interesting and innovative. You know, I often, and this is a plug for all of you college professors, please tell this to your students, but the program in African American history has, we have a fellowship program in the summer for undergraduates or either recent grad students, undergraduate graduates, I should say, who might be interested in entering grad school. But what we're able to do is to link these kinds of social and political worlds with the historical archival world. So for instance, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, but also the Library Company, we have a pamphlet written by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, Philadelphia-based ministers, who wrote the first political tract in this country that literally, they were disputing what Benjamin Rush said around Black people's seeming ability to not contract yellow fever. And they're like, no, in fact, we're human beings, we're the same as you. And we can get yellow fever. So the ways that we can even think about these political tracts in scientific ways, I think is important. And Eric Herschel has shown that today. So thank you so much for really illuminating work. I'm going to put this link in again. I'm going to show you the cover of this amazing book. He didn't give it all away. So
I gave a lot of it away.
He didn't give it all away. So look at this. You have to read this text and kind of, you know, just read about this Atlantic world history. He's crossing the British Atlantic and the colonial space that later becomes the United States and the United States. So it's a really interesting book. Eric, thank you. Thank you so much.
So Professor Owens, you're honestly a wonderful interlocutor. We can do this. I can do this for a long time. Yeah. So hopefully, I'm sure we'll see each other soon. And I just want to say thank you again for everybody for taking the hour and a half. And I should also say that I'm relying on many other scholars' work. We all do, including Professor Deidre Cooper Owens. Medical Bondage is a hugely important book in the last decade. And many of the names that I dropped in the last 2 hours also are. So there's a large conversation going on that's related to science and African-American history, particularly in these earlier periods, that are worth more people knowing about. And I'm just one bit in a larger pool of all that scholarship. So be on the lookout for other people, including Professor Cooper Owens, who are also doing that work.
Yes, well, thank you so much. Once again, Michelle Flamer, our board member, thank you. I learned a lot. Pamela McDonald, who asked a question, thank you. She said this has been wonderful, and she is on the Historical Society of the Mother Bethel AME Church.
Oh, so that's awesome.
You are pulling all of these people to come in. I wish you all a good night. I'm here in Lincoln, Nebraska. It is snowing. So I hope it's a bit warmer wherever you are and in Philadelphia. And once again, the Library Company thanks you for your support of our programming. And thank you for supporting Eric Herschel, an emergent voice in the history of slavery and the history of science. And trust me, you'll be hearing more from him and his brilliant mind. Thank you to Blanche Brown for the wonderful work that she's done behind the scenes. And so I will see you all at the next program, which will be February 3rd. We'll be featuring Dr. Will Thomas, award-winning author who has written a book called The Quest for Freedom. It is about his family. He comes from a slave-owning family during the colonial period in Virginia and Maryland. And he will be in conversation with one of the descendants of the families that he owned, who also has a connection to Georgetown University and that whole case around reparations. So we are bringing both of them together so that there can be a conversation about the past and the present and these thorny issues that abound for us, like reparations and what should be done I mean, we can think about it as the kind of finding your roots, you know, in a very real sense. How does a scholar confront the slave past that's in his family tree? So I hope you'll join us February 3rd for what will be, I think, a profound and generative discussion on this. So have a great night.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
All right.
Have a great night.
Bye.